I should probably do some work. Fuck.
Whoa.
What's that?
I just built a budgeting app in Base 44.
Guys.
We are 2 weeks away from the return of the biggest star in MMA history as Conor McGregor takes on Max Holloway at UFC 329. And I'm so pumped for this card. I am so pumped for this main event, getting to see Conor McGregor return to the octagon. And I'm also pumped to be able to go through and talk about this matchup in this video. So I'm going to be breaking down both of these fighters, talking about how they match up against each other, and then giving my winner pick at the end. But this video specifically is pretty unique compared to a lot of the other prediction videos I've done because it just feels like there are so many unknowns in this matchup. A lot of them on the Conor McGregor side just due to the layoff, the injury, the weight class this is taking place at. But then you also have the questions of Max Holloway, fighting up at 170 for the first time in his career. So there's a lot to talk about. I imagine this will be my longest single fight breakdown. But if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, drop your prediction in the comments. But we have to start it off here with the biggest superstar, Conor McGregor. Just going to run through some of the overview. So 5'9", 74.
He lost to Poirier twice? Damn. Oh, wait. Let me fix this. Check, 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 check.
4-3, 37 years old, which does seem kind of crazy. 22-6 pro record. And then the video, hit the like button, subscribe, drop your prediction in the comments. But we have to start it off here with the biggest superstar, Conor McGregor. Just going to run through some of the overview. So 5'9", 74-inch reach, 37 years old, which does seem kind of crazy. 22-6 pro record, and then 10-4 in the UFC. His last 2 fights have been losses to Dustin Poirier. The first one was the knockout loss in their rematch, and then he was finished, I guess, doctor stoppage in that third fight, the most recent.
How you guys doing
tonight? Performance.
I was thinking about I was thinking about going to an open mic night. Not tonight, but this weekend. Tomorrow. How are you all doing? How are my favorite little Taz babies doing tonight?
And we have to start off with the striking of Conor McGregor. And I think something that's kind of interesting going into this matchup is we're not exactly sure what kind of style he is going to, have and implement in this matchup, because his striking style has kind of changed throughout his career. For the vast majority, honestly, pretty much his entire run at 145, it was that, kind of point karate base, very fluid, lots of kicks, lots of spinning kicks, very bouncy, light on his feet. We saw once he started to move up in weight, he became a little bit more grounded. We saw that in the Diaz matchups, a little bit less fluid. Some of that also could have been, just a heavier weight class. And then instead of, a ton of body and head kicks and spinning attacks, we still saw some of those, but also it was attacking the legs in the Nate Diaz matchup. And I think especially in the second matchup, we did see that shift in style was a little bit more efficient in terms of the energy. I think kind of like the peak Conor McGregor style was what he showcased in the Eddie Alvarez fight. I feel like that's been his most natural blend of the karate style while also having the really clean boxing, where he was a little bit more grounded than his run at 145, but he was still very fluid, still had, the kicking game available to him, and then also was still able to be pretty efficient with his energy. We saw in the second Poirier fight, I guess one of the many comebacks he's had, that was very much a boxing heavy base, and then he kind of just completely flipped the switch going into the third matchup and went back to like the early karate base, which so late in your career, probably not great to just be like completely changing your style, from one fight to the next, but he did it. It's been a long layoff, so who knows exactly what he's going to implement in this matchup. If we're looking at what I think he should implement, I'm not a huge fan of just like the pure boxing style. It certainly is effective. Like, he looked good against Poirier. He won the first round. Poirier, obviously a great boxer, so the fact that that was competitive early means he can still be, a very good fighter with that style. And I guess the biggest shift in that specifically was his lead hand was just way more dangerous. In the other stances, he kind of uses the jab as like a rangefinder, whereas against Poirier in the rematch, he was kind of stinging with that jab. Sometimes, he'd slip off, get a little bit more power, kind of like a power jab in that matchup. And it is pretty efficient, like he's not burning a ton of energy, but we did see him struggle to check the kicks in that stance. And then it also just like erased a lot of his dynamic kicking arsenal, which was like a huge part of his rise, to become the champion. Looking at the karate style, I think it's a little bit better suited for him at 145, because I do think it's a style that is best used when you do have a size advantage, where Conor was just bigger than pretty much everyone he was fighting at 145 in terms of his height, his reach, his range. And so when he was able to have that karate base, use the kicks a lot, opponents just really struggled to kind of close the distance against him. And I also think it kind of fit with his fluidity at 145, where he did just look so fluid, the movement looked so clean and smooth when he was in featherweight, but it's probably not a style that's super efficient over 5 rounds, and we really never saw him get like truly extended with that karate, I guess, base striking style when he was at 145. And then we have the blended style, which, as I talked about, like I think that was his best, most clean performance against Eddie Alvarez. And I feel like that blended style really is the best of both worlds, where you have some efficiency in the energy department, but you still have the power. You can be grounded on some of your shots, but you still have the kicks available to you. And then also, I just think that's where we saw his cleanest shot selection. Everything was so intentional in that Eddie Alvarez matchup. Now, just looking at some of his, overall skills as a striker, the number one weapon is definitely the left hand. Like I talked about, aside from the second Poirier fight, the lead hand, the jab specifically, is primarily used as a rangefinder. He's really not trying to like sting you with that shot. It's just kind of to get him into range, calculate, where his opponent is to set up that piston of the left hand. The left hand is just like so precise. He doesn't load up, but it's so fast. And obviously he's had so much success landing that shot in the UFC, especially earlier on in his career. The spinning attacks were a big weapon for him, and they really kind of punished fighters from trying to circle away from that power hand, right? Because you're not trying to circle into that left, and so oftentimes fighters would, move away, circle to his lead side. Then he'd be able to throw that spinning attack to kind of cut them off in that direction and punish them there. The front kicks to the body are really, solid weapon for Conor, keeping his opponents at range. Also just kind of hurting them and wearing down the gas tank when you do attack the body. And then, prime Conor McGregor's distance management was pretty top tier. I think about like the Eddie Alvarez fight where Eddie's throwing a punch and it basically like barely touches Conor in the nose, and he is ready to counter with that left hand. His pull counters are nasty. The slide back left hands are money. Obviously the Jose Aldo knockout, that was, him catching Aldo being overly reckless. Now, defensively on the feet, I do think there are some concerns. We saw it with the calf kicks, although that was more of like that boxing heavy style. I think once we've seen him go up against kind of bigger opponents where he doesn't have that huge frame advantage, thinking of like, you know, the Nate Diaz fights, the Dustin Poirier second and third matchups, he kind of has to get into more of like these 50-50 exchanges, which he's not super comfortable in. Like, this might sound, you know, kind of obvious, but like, you know, you'd say most guys want to be in like one-way traffic, right? Where you're kind of dictating the pace, you're dictating the range and all of that. And I think every fighter would rather just be the one who's landing and not getting hit. But you do have some fighters who kind of thrive in those back and forth matchups. Thinking like a Dustin Poirier, a Justin Gaethje, and that's just not Conor McGregor's style. That's not where, you know, he finds his most success. Like, he wants to be in control of the range, picking at his opponents, and just, you know, kind of making them press like we saw against Aldo and Eddie Alvarez. And then durability-wise, I think maybe that's also kind of a factor in this, where the chin, kind of sketchy, right? Dropped by Khabib, knocked out by Dustin. People forget, like, people want to throw away that third matchup because of the injury, but like, Conor was trying to jump a guillotine because Poirier hurt him on the feet. And specifically in those Dustin matchups, like, he didn't eat the shots up at 155 super well. Now, obviously, Dustin is a big power puncher. So, like, if you're getting hit clean by Dustin Poirier, regardless of who you are, it's probably going to suck. But just something to kind of keep in mind here with Conor. I'm really not expecting much grappling in this matchup. Conor defensively isn't great. For how fluid and a dynamic mover he is, like, his sprawl is kind of underwhelming. And I think his biggest weakness is that he just doesn't control posture when he's on the bottom. Like, he just really lets dudes, whether it was the Khabib fight, the third Dustin Poirier matchup, like, he just lets guys kind of rain down big shots on him. But like, Max Holloway's not known for his ground and pound. I don't think this fight is really going to take place on the ground, I guess, unless maybe one of them drops the other, and then we could see some of that, but probably not going to play a huge factor here. And then I do want to talk about the 170 factor and the layoff, but I'm going to do it after I talk about Max Holloway, because I think there's some points I can make for both of these guys. But now looking at Max Holloway, I was kind of surprised they gave him this opportunity. I was a little pessimistic about the matchmaking just because I thought it's a really, really tough return fight for Conor McGregor here. Max Holloway, 5'11", 69-inch reach, 34 years old, 27-9 as a pro, 23-9 in the UFC. I mean, pretty much had his entire career in the UFC. He's coming off a pretty dominant, like, underwhelming decision loss against Charles Oliveira, but his previous two lightweight fights against strikers, he knocked out Justin Gaethje, now the champion, really had a masterclass against him, and then also picked up a decision win against Dustin Poirier. Now, that Oliveira fight, I'll just touch on it right off the bat here. 50-45 on all three scorecards, 21 minutes of control time. Not a good look. However, I think it's pretty irrelevant in this matchup. You know, against Max Holloway, he landed 4. But Conor's last takedown was back in 2014, and Conor McGregor is not Charles Oliveira, so, like, I would be shocked if Conor goes to a grappling heavy game plan, especially just cardio-wise over 5 rounds. Like, he's not going to hold up if he can't find an early finish, and if Charles isn't finishing Max Holloway on the ground, I do not think Conor McGregor is going to get that one done. Looking at Max Holloway and his striking, he just has a super diverse skill set. He can fight from both stances. He has a really active lead hand. His jab is nice, lead hooks. He really likes to use that lead hand to feint, set up some bigger shots. Really impressive kicking game, works all 3 levels, head, body, legs. Can throw it with the back leg or the front leg, the spinning attacks. That spinning back kick has been money for him recently. We saw that play a huge role in the Justin Gaethje fight. Also some really nice teeps. And then he just flows through his combinations really well with his stance switches because he is so comfortable, fighting and throwing from both stances. Since moving up, I think we've seen Holloway have a pretty significant speed advantage against some of the more established lightweights like a Justin Gaethje, like a Dustin Poirier. And I know Max Holloway isn't really known for his power, especially at 145. Like, people thought he was really pillow-fisted. The power's kind of been there at 155, and he's also been a little bit more willing to actually sit down on his shots. Like, even excluding the Justin Gaethje knockout, which obviously was massive, he was still hurting Justin Gaethje throughout that fight. Also, a Dustin Poirier hurt a few different times in their matchup. Looking at the defensive side of it, he was always known as someone who just had this iron chin, and I still think the chin is very good, and he showcased some good recoverability up in weight, but this certainly isn't like the chin of 5-6 years ago, right? He was knocked out by Ilia Topuria, dropped by Gaethje, not officially, but he was dropped, and then also dropped by Dustin Poirier. But like I said, the Gaethje-Dustin matchups, he did recover pretty well, to not get finished after getting hurt. I definitely say Holloway's best kind of trait is just his insane pace, his cardio. He averages 6.9 significant strikes per minute. I believe that was up to 7.1 prior to the Oliveira matchup, where he just got stifled for 25 minutes. But he has the most significant strikes in the UFC by over 1,200, and then he also has the record for most significant strikes landed in a fight with 445. So those are my thoughts on Max Holloway. Now let's talk about this fight taking place up at welterweight, because, as someone who's kind of been pessimistic about Conor's chances in this matchup, it seems like the pushback I get is this being at 170 heavily favors Conor, and not even necessarily that it favors him where he should be the betting favorite or something like that, but the reason why I'm too low is I'm not, taking into account that this is at welterweight enough in terms of Conor McGregor. And he does have more experience up in weight. I do think he'll be the heavier guy on fight night. He's had 3 UFC fights at welterweight, 4 at lightweight. Max has had 0 at welterweight, 4 at lightweight. And so, yeah, Conor has a little bit more experience, just fighting with that weight on his frame. It's also very possible that in all this time off, maybe Conor can't even make 155 anymore, and he's kind of more in that legit welterweight frame. So I do take that. And, Max Holloway last fought at 145 just a couple of years ago in 2024, whereas Conor hasn't made 145 since 2015. So I will give it, to Conor here that he probably will be the bigger guy in this matchup, at least in terms of their fight weight. And yes, Conor's more experienced at 170, but I'm just not really sure if that's a huge positive. Now, obviously it's good that he has more experience than Holloway, but I don't really think Conor is best suited to be in a heavier, kind of more muscled up weight class. I talked about at 145, he really thrived, being the bigger guy, having the longer range with his distance management. He goes from being a really big 145er to now a pretty undersized welterweight, and obviously he's not going up against a Carlos Prates or someone like that, but still. And Conor's a guy whose striking wins with fluidity and speed. He's not one of these strikers that is dangerous and powerful because of just his raw physicality and his strength. And so we have seen some fighters who have that just natural raw power move up and they see a big boost in their power. I think Alex Pereira recently is a good example of that, moving up to 205. I think Anthony Johnson is a great example of that, where you think someone who's trying to make 170, you go up to 205, you're probably not going to have the same power. No, the power was completely there, and he's one of the hardest hitting fighters in the history of the UFC, and you just didn't really see it as much when he was draining his body, cutting down in weight. So that is a thing that you can move up in weight and the power can be more prevalent. I just don't really think that's the case for Conor. And you kind of have his own quote where he says, timing beats speed and precision beats power. McGregor's not one of these dudes who's muscled up and just gonna wing these huge shots and generate power that way. Conor is someone who's hurting his opponents through his timing and his precision, and I think both of those things kind of take hits with him, going up to 170. I think we even see it in the Nate Diaz fights where he was still landing and hurting Nate Diaz, but it's not like he moves up in weight and just has like the touch of death. Even the Eddie Alvarez fight up at 155, like, yeah, he's hurting Eddie, but it's because he's just landing at the perfect time. He's seeing everything so well defensively. He's able to counter. And he rocked Eddie Alvarez like 4 or 5 times before he actually found the finish. It's not like he just needs to land one shot and his opponent is going away. And I just think he kind of has less of a chance of having those bigger moments up at 170. And like I said with the Diaz fights, right? Like, yes, he's hurting him, but it's more of like, all right, I got knocked down, I can get back up. Not like, oh, I just got hit with a hammer and I can no longer continue, or like, I have no clue where I am. And then on the other side here with Max Holloway, I will say, like, Holloway's a small welterweight. He just got out-physicaled at 155. He was a big featherweight, now probably going to be a small welterweight. And I don't really expect him to put on a ton of weight. Like, I don't think he views this as his long-term weight class. I think he kind of sees this as a one-off. But once again, like, Conor McGregor isn't a legit welterweight either. And if he is, I don't know if that's a super positive thing when it comes to his specific skill set, at least in terms of what he did best, back when he's beating Jose Aldo, beating Chad Mendes, beating Eddie Alvarez. Now I want to talk about the layoff here, because it will be 5 years and 1 day since Conor McGregor's last fight. And I kind of feel like people are just like underestimating how bad Conor McGregor could look, and maybe that's like a negative view of this, but I don't know. I just hear some of the talk about this matchup, and it's like Conor was coming off of back-to-back losses, getting knocked out, suffering a serious ankle injury, having the doctor stoppage. He has taken, just over 5 years off at this point. His last win was back in 2020. He is 10 years removed from his prime, which I'd consider to be the Eddie Alvarez win. And this is a guy who clearly has not been like dialed in with his training. This is not a GSP situation where he goes away but is still dialed in, comes back, looks great against Michael Bisping. This is a guy where I think pretty much everyone at different points thought, all right, this guy's done. Like, he's not coming back. He's never going to fight again. And so I'm not hoping he looks bad, but I think there's a, kind of a wide range of outcomes here where Conor can come in and really just look like a complete shell of his former self. And maybe that's just like copium of people not wanting to put that into the universe. But I did just kind of want to throw it out there, because even if this isn't a prime version of Max Holloway, he's still been active and competing against the best guys in the world, while Conor McGregor has gone through these phases of caring about MMA, not caring about MMA, partying, all of these things. But now let's finally talk about how I think this fight is actually going to play out. And I do think Max Holloway's kind of a bad matchup for Conor, even just like in terms of, I think it's a tough matchup in terms of like the level that Holloway's at right now versus the layoff, all of that stuff. But even just stylistically, I think it's tough. I think prime for prime, I believe Conor McGregor's the better fighter, but I think a prime Conor McGregor versus a prime Max Holloway, it's a pretty tough matchup for Conor just because of Holloway's, great chin, crazy pace. He's kind of just like a significantly better Nate Diaz in that sense. And I know this isn't a prime for prime matchup, but a lot of those issues still kind of remain. I think Conor's going to be in serious trouble if this fight goes long. I mean, cardio was a concern in his prime, and coming off this layoff at 37 years old, I can't imagine he's like magically fixed the cardio issue. And so I think Conor's going to come out, and I think he's actually going to look pretty solid early on in this matchup. I do think he has the power advantage. I still think just like, regardless of how much he's been training, he's always going to look pretty slick on the feet when he's competing. And Holloway can be pretty hittable. We saw in the third Volk fight, he would kind of, crash into range and just chill there. Like, he wouldn't effectively get out of range. He was dropped in the pocket against Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje. He got caught kind of trying to switch stances in range against Ilia Topuria. But Max Holloway doesn't make the typical mistakes that Conor McGregor capitalizes on, where Holloway's not the type of guy to really overextend and overreach to allow for someone like those pull counters, the slide back left hands. And so I don't know if there's going to be a ton of those opportunities available for Conor in this matchup. You know, you look at like Jose Aldo crashing in, Eddie Alvarez crashing in. I don't think you're going to get those level of overextensions in this fight. And like those are the kind of car crashes that lead to the hardest shots. You can hit someone clean across the chin, but if they're retreating and their momentum's kind of going away from you, it's not going to have the same effect as someone who's closing the distance with your fist. I don't know if that's physics or whatever it is, but it's true. And so we'll see if, you know, McGregor can bait out, I guess, some kind of reaches out of Max Holloway. I think Holloway's going to have the ability to kind of pick from the outside against Conor, which is something I guess he hasn't dealt with a ton throughout his career. Like I talked about at 145, a lot of the guys would have to close the distance against him. I guess maybe you could say Nate Diaz, but like I don't think he really maximized his frame in those matchups. It is kind of a unique stylistic test here. I know they fought previously, but Max Holloway was like 22 years old or, you know, something crazy like that. And so I think Holloway can, you know, look kind of good early on. I think he's going to give Conor McGregor a lot to consider with the stance switches, the working all three levels. This is definitely like the most diverse striker he has gone up against. I think Holloway's definitely going to use his long-range weapons, at least early on. And I think if Holloway can survive the first couple of rounds, I do think he can really get rolling in this matchup and make it look kind of bad. I'm pretty surprised that Conor is gaining like betting steam. The last time I checked, he had, I don't know if it's like fallen below a 2-to-1 dog. I think he was like minus 195 or plus 195 the last time I checked, which seems kind of crazy because the way I'm kind of picturing this fight, I think if Conor comes out and looks really good, where you're like, this is pretty similar to the guy that we saw, you know, take on Dustin Poirier, even though he didn't win those fights, like that's still a very, very good fighter. I think if he looks like that, I still think this is kind of a competitive, tough-ish matchup for him. And then there's just so many unknown factors with the preparation that could make Conor McGregor look rough, like a shell of his former self. The layoff, the injury, the inconsistent training, the age. I feel like there's just so many things that could kind of go wrong here for Conor. And so as you can probably tell, I'm going to be backing Max Holloway in this matchup. If Conor came out and looked awesome and picked up a win, like that would be really cool. It would be fun to see. I just have a really tough time going out and, you know, saying I think it's more likely than not that Conor McGregor wins this fight. So I'm going to go with Max Holloway, round 3 knockout. I think this is a big opportunity for Holloway. I think he has the potential to look really, really good in this matchup, especially if Conor, you know, isn't close to the guy that left. But even if Conor looks good early on, man, that pace of Holloway into the later rounds, I think Holloway is a more dangerous, powerful striker than people will give him credit for up in weight. I know he was very decision heavy at 145. He packs a legit punch at 155. I assume the power is still going to be there at 170, at least, you know, relative to what it was at 155. And even though he wasn't able to finish a guy like Poirier, you know, he didn't finish Gaethje until the final bell, I had more confidence in those guys' cardio. Whereas I think if Conor starts to fade in the cardio department, that's when Max Holloway is really going to turn it on. So I'm going to go Max Holloway, round 3 knockout. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're backing Conor McGregor and it's not just, you know, hoping he wins, I'd like to hear the reasoning, you know, the breakdown. You know, let me hear it in the comments. But if you enjoyed, hit the like button, subscribe. Stay tuned. I'm going to have a Paddy Pimblett, Benoit Saint Denis breakdown. I'll also, as always, have my full card breakdown posted on the channel. So thank you all for stopping by. Pumped for this card, and I will see you all in the next one.
Get ready to rise with more more shine. Discover the Sealy Posturepedic collection at Ashley, featuring precision fit coils arranged right where you need them for targeted support night after night. Sealy at Ashley. Wake up to what's next.
That's crazy.
Yeah, that is beyond sick. I mean, as a culture, how have we gotten to the point where we celebrate killing a baby based on their gender? I mean, that is ridiculous. How is it allowed to murder someone on the basis of gender? I mean, what's this woman took this woman took an abortion pill at her gender reveal. Yeah, that is beyond sick. I mean, as a culture, how have we gotten to the point where we celebrate killing a baby based on their gender? I mean, that is ridiculous. How is it allowed to murder someone on the basis of gender? I mean, what sin did the baby commit? Well, of course, she committed no sin. The only sin she committed was being a girl. And for that, which of course she had no control over, she was murdered by her own mother. And as a pro-lifer, I've always liked to assume that those who are pro-choice don't really understand what they're doing. They don't understand that they are killing an innocent baby. But then in this video, when they're celebrating it and her friends are chanting to kill it, I know that they know exactly what they're doing. They are killing an innocent baby and celebrating about it. I can't give them a lemon guilt. An innocent person was murdered on camera. Again, not for a sin that she committed, but just for being a girl. And that is evil. What do you think? Comment down below.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of round number one, Burdine has called a stop to this contest based on a doctor stoppage to claim the winner by GKO Dustin the Diamond Florida.
To come on
Dustin the Diamond Florida.
to come on the heels of the White House card, in which there was a sort of tightrope that you had to walk to keep the sporting from the spectacle of and the politics